Volume 1, Chapter 9 of Rob Roy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Rob Roy by Sir Walter Scott, Volume 1, Chapter 9th. One of the thieves come back again? I'll stand close. He dares not wrong me now, so near the house, and call in vain 'tis, till I see him offer it. The Widow. A stranger? Echoed the Justice. Not upon business, I trust, for I'll be... His protestation was cut short by the answer of the man himself.
My business is of a nature somewhat onerous and particular,
said my acquaintance Mr. Campbell, for it was he, the very Scotchman whom I had seen at Northallerton.
And I must solicit your honour to give instant and heedful consideration to it. I believe, Mr. Morris,
he added, fixing his eye on that person with a look of peculiar firmness and almost ferocity,
I believe ye ken brawly what I am. I believe ye cannot have forgotten what passed at our last meeting on the road.
Morris's jaw dropped, his countenance became the colour of tallow, his teeth chattered, and he gave visible signs of the utmost consternation.
Take heart of grace, man,
said Campbell,
and dinna sit clattering your jaws there like a pair of castanets. I think there can be no difficulty in your telling Mr. Justice that ye have seen me of yore, and ken me to be a cavalier of fortune and a man of honour. Ye ken full well you will be sometime a resident in my vicinity, when I may have the power, as I will possess the inclination, to do you as good a turn.
Sir, I believe you to be a man of honour, and, as you say, a man of fortune. Yes, Mr. Inglewood, he added, clearing his voice, I really believe this gentleman to be so. And what are this gentleman's commands with me? Said the Justice, somewhat peevishly. One man introduces another like the rhymes in the house that Jack built, and I get company without either peace or conversation.
It shall be yours, sir, answered Campbell, in a brief period of time. I come to release your mind from a piece of troublesome duty, not to make increment to it.
Body me, then you are welcome as ever Scot was to England, and that's not saying much. But get on, man. Let's hear what you have got to say at once.
I presume this gentleman, continued to the North Briton, told you there was a person of the name of Campbell with him when he had the mischance to lose his valise.
He has not mentioned such a name from beginning to end of the matter, said the Justice.
Oh, I conceive, replied Mr. Campbell. Mr. Morris was kindly afeard of committing a stranger into collision with the judicial forms of the country. But as I understand my evidence is necessary to the compurgation of one honest gentleman here, Mr. Francis Osbaldistone, who has been most unjustly suspected, I will dispense with the precaution. Ye will therefore, he added, addressing Morris with the same determined look and accent, please tell Mr. Justice Inglewood whether we did not travel several miles together on the road, in consequence of your own anxious request and suggestion, reiterated once and again, both on the evening that we were at Northallerton, and there declined by me, but afterwards accepted when I overtook ye on the road near Clowberry Allers, and was prevailed on by ye to resign my own intentions of proceeding to Rothbury, and for my misfortune to accompany ye on your proposed route. It's a melancholy truth, answered Morris, holding down his head, as he gave this general assent to the long and leading question which Campbell put to him, and seemed to acquiesce in the statement it contained with rueful docility. And I presume you can also asseverate to his worship that no man is better qualified than I am to bear testimony in this case, seeing that I was by you and near you, constantly during the whole occurrence.
No man better qualified, certainly, said Morris, with a deep and embarrassed sigh. And why the devil did you not assist him then? Said the Justice, since by Mr. Morris's account there were but two robbers, so you were 2 to 2, and you are both stout likely men.
Sir, if it please your worship, said Campbell, I have been all my life a man of peace and quietness, no ways given to broils or batteries. Mr. Morris, who belongs, as I understand, or hath belonged to his Majesty's army, might have used his pleasure in resistance, he travelling, as I also understand, with a great charge of treasure, what for me, who had but my own small peculiar to defend, and who am moreover a man of a pacific occupation, I was unwilling to commit myself to hazard in the matter. I looked at Campbell as he muttered these words, and never recollect to have seen a more singular contrast than that between the strong daring sternness expressed in his harsh features, and the air of composed meekness and simplicity which his language assumed. There was even a slight ironical smile lurking about the corners of his mouth, which seemed, involuntarily as it were, to intimate his disdain of the quiet and peaceful character which he thought proper to assume, and which led me to entertain strange suspicions that his concern in the violence done to Morris had been something very different from that of a fellow sufferer, or even of a mere spectator. Perhaps some such suspicions crossed the Justice's mind at the moment, for he exclaimed, as if by way of ejaculation, "Body o' me, but this is a strange story." The North Briton seemed to guess at what was passing in his mind, for he went on, with a change of manner and tone, dismissing from his countenance some part of the hypocritical affectation of humility which had made him obnoxious to suspicion, and saying, with a more frank and unconstrained air, To say the truth, I am just ane of those canny folks who care not to fight but when they hae gotten something to fight for, which did not chance to be my predicament when I fell in with these greens. But that your worship may know that I am a person of good fame and character, please to cast your eye o'er at that billet.
Mr. Inglewood took the paper from his hand and read, half aloud, "These are to certify that the bearer, Robert Campbell of some place which I cannot pronounce," interjected the Justice, "is a person of good lineage and peaceable demeanour, travelling towards England on his own proper affairs, etc., 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 given under our hand at our castle of Argyle."
A select testimonial, sir, which I thought fit to impetrate for that worthy nobleman.
Here he raised his hand to his head as if to touch his hat.
MacCallum Mayor.
"MacCallum who, sir?" said the Justice.
Him the Southern called the Duke of Argyle.
"I know the Duke of Argyle very well to be a nobleman of great worth and distinction, and a true lover of his country. I was one of those that stood by him in 1714 when he unhorsed the Duke of Marlborough out of his command. I wish we had more noblemen like him. He was an honest Tory in those days, and hand in glove with Ormond, and he has succeeded to the present government, as I have done myself, for the peace and quiet of his country, for I cannot presume that great man to have been actuated, as violent folks pretend, with the fear of losing his places and regiment. His testimonial, as you call it, Mr. Campbell, is perfectly satisfactory. And now, what have you got to say to this matter of the robbery?"
Briefly this, if it please your worship, that Mr. Morris might as well charge it against the baby yet to be barren, or against myself e'en, as against this young gentleman, Mr. Osbaldistone, for I am nae unafraid to depend that the person whom he took for him was a shorter man and a thicker man, but also for I chanced to obtain a glisk at his visage, as his false face slipped aside, that he was a man of other features and complexion than those of this young gentleman, Mr. Osbaldistone, and I believe," he added,
turning round with a natural, yet somewhat sterner air to Mr. Morris.
That the gentleman will allow I had better opportunity to take cognizance who were present on that occasion than he, being, I believe, much the cooler of the two.
I agree to it, sir, I agree to it perfectly, said Morris, shrinking back as Campbell moved his chair towards him to fortify his appeal. And I incline, sir, he added, addressing Mr. Inglewood, to retract my information as to Mr. Osbaldistone, and I request, sir, you will permit him, sir, to go about his business, and me to go about mine also. Your worship may have business to settle with Mr. Campbell, and I am rather in haste to be gone. Then there go the declarations, said the Justice, throwing them into the fire. And now you are at perfect liberty, Mr. Osbaldistone, and you, Mr. Morris, are set quite at your ease.
Ay,
said Campbell, eyeing Morris as he assented with a rueful grin to the Justice's observations.
which lack the ease I told under a pair of harrows. But fear nothing, Mr. Morris. Ye and I main lay the house together. I will see ye safe. I hope you will not doubt my honour when I say take the next highway, and then we part company. And if we dinna meet as friends in Scotland, it will be your own fault.
With such a lingering look of terror as the condemned criminal throws when he is informed that the cart awaits him, Morris arose, but when on his legs appeared to hesitate.
I tell thee, man, fear nothing,
reiterated Campbell.
I will keep my word with ye. Why, thou sheep's heart, how do ye ken but we may can pick up some spearings of your valise, if ye will be amenable to good counsel? Our horses are ready. Bid the justice farewell, man, and show your southern breeding.
Morris, thus exhorted and encouraged, took his leave, under the escort of Mr. Campbell, but apparently new scruples and terrors had struck him before they left the house, for I heard Campbell reiterating assurances of safety and protection as they left the anteroom.
By the soul of my body, man, thou art as safe as in thy father's kail yard. Zounds, that a child with sic a black beard should hae nae mair heart than a hen partridge. Come on with ye, like a frank fellow, ance and for aye.
The voices died away, and the subsequent trampling of their horses announced to us that they had left the mansion of Justice Inglewood. The joy which that worthy magistrate received at this easy conclusion of a matter which threatened him with some trouble in his judicial capacity was somewhat damped by reflection on what his clerk's views of the transaction might be at his return. Now I shall have Jobson on my shoulders about these damned papers. I doubt I should not have destroyed them after all, but hang it, it is only paying his fees, and that will make all smooth. And now, Miss Di Vernon, though I have liberated all the others, I intend to sign a writ for committing you to the custody of Mother Blake's, my old housekeeper, for the evening, and we will send for my neighbour, Mrs. Musgrave, and the Miss Dawkins, and your cousins, and have old Cobbs the fiddler, and be as merry as the maids. And Frank Osbaldistone and I will have a carouse that will make us fit company for you in half an hour. Thanks, most worshipful, returned Miss Vernon, but as matters stand, we must return instantly to Osbaldistone Hall, where they do not know what has become of us, and relieve my uncle of his anxiety on my cousin's account, which is just the same as if one of his own sons were concerned. I believe it truly, said the Justice, for when his eldest son Archie came to a bad end in that unlucky affair of Sir John Fenwick's, old Hildebrand used to hollow out his name as readily as any of the remaining six, and then complain that he could not recollect which of his sons had been hanged. So, pray, hasten home and relieve his paternal solicitude, since go you must. But hark thee hither, Heathblossom, he said, pulling her towards him by the hand, and in a good-humoured tone of admonition, another time let the law take its course, without putting your pretty finger into her old musty pie, all full of fragments of law, gibberish, French, and dog Latin. And, Di, my beauty, let young fellows show each other the way through the moors, in case you should lose your own road, while you are pointing out theirs, my pretty will o' the wisp. With this admonition he saluted and dismissed Miss Vernon, and took an equally kind farewell of me.
Thou seems to be a good tight lad, Mr. Frank, and I remember thy father too, he was my playfellow at school. Hark thee, lad, ride early at night, and don't swagger with chance passengers on the king's highway. What, man? All the king's liege subjects are not bound to understand joking, and it's ill cracking jests on matters of felony. And here's poor Di Vernon too, in a manner alone and deserted on the face of this wide earth, and left to ride and run and scamper at her own silly pleasure. Thou must be careful of Di, or, egad, I will turn a young fellow again on purpose and fight thee myself, although I must own it would be a great deal of trouble. And now get ye both gone, and leave me to my pipe of tobacco and my meditations. For what says the song? The Indian leaf doth briefly burn, so doth man's strength to weakness turn. The fire of youth extinguished quite, comes age, like embers, dry and white. Think of this as you take tobacco. The lines here quoted belong to, or were altered from, a set of verses at one time very popular in England, beginning, "Tobacco that is withered quite." In Scotland, the celebrated Ralph Erskine, author of the Gospel Sonnets, published what he called Smoking Spiritualized in two parts, the first part being an old meditation upon smoking tobacco. It begins, "This Indian weed, now withered quite, though green at noon, cut down at night, shows thy decay, all flesh is hay, thus thank and smoke tobacco." I was much pleased with the gleams of sense and feeling which escaped from the Justice through the vapours of sloth and self-indulgence, assured him of my respect to his admonitions, and took a friendly farewell of the honest magistrate and his hospitable mansion. We found a repast prepared for us in the anteroom, which we partook of slightly, and rejoined the same servant of Sir Hildebrand who had taken our horses at our entrance, and who had been directed, as he informed Miss Vernon, by Mr. Rashleigh, to wait and attend upon us home. We rode a little way in silence, for, to say truth, my mind was too much bewildered with the events of the morning to permit me to be the first to break it. At length Miss Vernon exclaimed, as if giving vent to her own reflections, "Well, Rashleigh is a man to be feared and wondered at, and all but loved. He does whatever he pleases, and makes all others his puppets, has a player ready to perform every part which he imagines, and an invention and readiness which supply expedients for every emergency." "You think then," said I, answering rather to her meaning than to the express words she made use of, "that this Mr. Campbell, whose appearance was so opportune, and who trussed up and carried off my accuser as a falcon trusses a partridge, was an agent of Mr. Rashleigh Osbaldistone's?" "I do guess as much," replied Diana, "and shrewdly suspect, moreover, that he would hardly have appeared so very much in the nick of time, if I had not happened to meet Rashleigh in the hall at the Justice's." "In that case my thanks are chiefly due to you, my fair preserver." "To be sure they are," returned Diana, "and pray suppose them paid, and accepted with a gracious smile, for I do not care to be troubled with hearing them in good earnest, and am much more likely to yawn than to behave becoming. In short, Mr. Frank, I wish to serve you, and I have fortunately been able to do so, and have only one favour to ask in return, and that is, that you will say no more about it. But who comes here to meet us, bloody with spurring, fiery red with haste?" "It is a subordinate man of law, I think, no less than Mr. Joseph Jobson." And Mr. Joseph Jobson it proved to be, in great haste, and, as it speedily appeared, in most extreme bad humour. He came up to us and stopped his horse, as we were about to pass with a slight salutation. "So, sir, so, Miss Vernon, I see well enough how it is. Bail put in during my absence, I suppose. I should like to know who drew the recognisance, that's all. If his worship uses this form of procedure often, I advise him to get another clerk, that's all, for I shall certainly dim it." "Or suppose he get this present clerk stitched to his sleeve, Mr. Jobson," said Diana, "would not that do as well?"
And pray, how does Farmer Rutledge, Mr. Jobson? I hope you found him able to sign, seal, and deliver." This question seemed greatly to increase the wrath of the man of law. He looked at Miss Vernon with such an air of spite and resentment as laid me under a strong temptation to knock him off his horse with the butt end of my whip, which I only suppressed in consideration of his insignificance. "Farmer Rutledge, ma'am?" said the clerk, as soon as his indignation permitted him to articulate. "Farmer Rutledge is in as handsome enjoyment of his health as you are. It's all a bam, ma'am, all a bamboozle and a bite, that affair of his illness, and if you did not know as much before, you know it now, ma'am." "Ah, you there now?" replied Miss Vernon, with an affectation of extreme and simple wonder. "Sure you don't say so, Mr. Jobson." "But I do say so, ma'am," rejoined the incensed scribe; "and moreover I say that the old miserly clod-breaker called me pettifogger, ma'am, and said I came to hunt for a job, ma'am, which I have no more right to have said to me than any other gentleman of my profession, ma'am, especially as I am clerk to the peace, having and holding said office under Trigessimo Septimo Henrici Octavi and Primo Guglielmi, the first of King William, ma'am, of glorious and immortal memory, our immortal deliverer from papists and pretenders, and wooden shoes and warming pans, Miss Vernon." "Sad things these wooden shoes and warming pans," retorted the young lady, who seemed to take pleasure in augmenting his wrath; "and it is a comfort you don't seem to want a warming pan at present, Mr. Jobson. I am afraid Gaffer Rutledge has not confined his incivility to language. Are you sure he did not give you a beating?" "Beating, ma'am? No, no man alive shall beat me, I promise you, ma'am." "That is according as you happen to merit, sir," said I; "for your mode of speaking to this young lady is so unbecoming, that, if you do not change your tone, I shall think it worth while to chastise you myself." "Chastise, sir? And me, sir? Do you know whom you speak to, sir?" "Yes, sir," I replied; "you say yourself you are clerk of peace to the county, and Gaffer Rutledge says you are a pettifogger, and in neither capacity are you entitled to be impertinent to a young lady of fashion." Miss Vernon laid her hand on my arm, and exclaimed, "Come, Mr. Osbaldistone, I will have no assaults and battery on Mr. Jobson. I am not in sufficient charity with him to permit a single touch of your whip. Why, he would live on it for a term at least. Besides, you have already hurt his feelings sufficiently. You have called him impertinent." "I don't value his language, miss," said the clerk, somewhat crestfallen. "Besides, impertinent is not an actionable word, but pettifogger is slander in the highest degree, and that I will make Gaffer Rutledge know to his cost, and all who maliciously repeat the same, to the breach of the public peace, and the taking away of my private good name." "Never mind that, Mr. Jobson," said Miss Vernon; "you know, where there is nothing, your own law allows that the king himself must lose his rights; and for the taking away of your good name, I pity the poor fellow who gets it, and wish you joy of losing it with all my heart." "Very well, ma'am. Good evening, ma'am. I have no more to say. Only there are laws against papists, which it would be well for the land were they better executed. There's 3rd and 4th Edward the Sixth, of antiphoners, missals, grails, professionals, manuals, legends, pies, portuasses, and those that have such trinkets in their possession, Miss Vernon. And there's summoning of papists to take the oaths, and there are popish recusant convicts under the first of his present Majesty, ay, and there are penalties for hearing mass, c. 23rd of Queen Elizabeth, and 3rd James I, chapter 25th, and there are estates to be registered, and deeds and wills to be enrolled, and double taxes to be made, according to the acts in that case made and provided. See the new edition of the statutes at large, published under the careful revision of Joseph Jobson, gentleman, clerk of the peace," said Miss Vernon. "Also, and above all," continued Jobson, "for I speak to your warning, you, Diana Vernon, spinstress, not being a femme couverte, and being a convict popish recusant, are bound to repair to your own dwelling, and that by the nearest way, under penalty of being held felon to the king, and diligently to seek for passage at common ferries,
and to tarry there but one ebb and flood, and unless you can have it in such places, to walk every day into the water up to the knees, a saying to pass over." "A sort of Protestant penance for my Catholic errors, I suppose," said Miss Vernon, laughing. "Well, I thank you for the information, Mr. Jobson, and will hie me home as fast as I can, and be a better housekeeper in time coming. Good night, my dear Mr. Jobson, thou mirror of clerical courtesy." "Good night, ma'am, and remember the law is not to be trifled with." And we rode on our separate ways.
"There he goes for a troublesome, mischief-making tool," said Miss Vernon, as she gave a glance after him. "It is hard that persons of birth and rank and estate should be subjected to the official impertinence of such a paltry pickthank as that, merely for believing as the whole world believed not much above 100 years ago, for certainly our Catholic faith has the advantage of antiquity at least." "I was much tempted to have broken the rascal's head," I replied. "You would have acted very like a hasty young man," said Miss Vernon, "and yet, had my own hand been an ounce heavier than it is, I think I should have laid its weight upon him. Well, it does not signify complaining, but there are three things for which I am much to be pitied, if any one thought it worth while to waste any compassion upon me." "And what are these three things, Miss Vernon, may I ask? Will you promise me your deepest sympathy if I tell you?" "Certainly. Can you doubt it?" I replied, closing my horse nearer to hers as I spoke, with an expression of interest which I did not attempt to disguise.
"Well, it is very seducing to be pitied after all, so here are my three grievances.
In the first place, I am a girl and not a young fellow, and would be shut up in a madhouse if I did half the things that I have a mind to, and that, if I had your happy prerogative of acting as you list, would make all the world mad with imitating and applauding me."
"I can't quite afford you the sympathy you expect upon this score," I replied. "The misfortune is so general, that it belongs to one half of the species, and the other half—"
"Are so much better cared for that they are jealous of their prerogatives," interrupted Miss Vernon. "I forgot you were a party interested. Nay," she said, as I was going to speak, "that soft smile is intended to be the preface of a very pretty compliment respecting the peculiar advantages which Die Vernon's friends and kinsmen enjoy, by her being born one of the Helots. But spare me the utterance, my good friend, and let us try whether we shall agree better on the second count of my indictment against fortune, as that quill-driving puppy would call it.
I belong to an oppressed sect and antiquated religion, and instead of getting credit for my devotion, as is due to all good girls beside, my kind friend, Justice Inglewood, may send me to the house of correction."
"Merely for worshipping God in the way of my ancestors, and say, as old Pembroke did to the Abbess of Wilton, when he usurped her convent and establishment, 'Go spin, you jade, go spin.'" Note F. The Abbess of Wilton.
"This is not a cureless evil," said I gravely. "Consult some of our learned divines, or consult your own excellent understanding, Miss Vernon, and surely the particulars in which our religious creed differs from that in which you have been educated."
"Hush!" said Diana, placing her forefinger on her mouth. "Hush! No more of that. Forsake the faith of my gallant fathers. I would as soon, were I a man, forsake their banner when the tide of battle pressed hardest against it,
and turn, like a hireling recreant, to join the victorious enemy."
"I honour your spirit, Miss Vernon, and as to the inconveniences to which it exposes you, I can only say, that wounds sustained for the sake of conscience carry their own balsam with the blow."
"Ay, but they are fretful and irritating for all that. But I see, hard of heart as you are, my chance of beating hemp or drawing out flax into marvellous coarse thread affects you as little as my condemnation to coif and pinners instead of bevel and cockade, so I will spare myself the fruitless pains of telling my third cause of vexation."
"Nay, my dear Miss Vernon, do not withdraw your confidence, and I will promise you that the threefold sympathy due to your very unusual causes of distress shall be all duly and truly paid to account of the third, providing You assure me that it is one which you neither share with all womankind, nor even with every Catholic in England, who, God bless you, are still a sect more numerous than we Protestants, in our zeal for church and state, would desire them to be." "It is indeed," said Diana, with a manner greatly altered and more serious than I had yet seen her assume, "a misfortune that well merits compassion. I am by nature, as you may easily observe, of a frank and unreserved disposition, a plain, true hearted girl, who would willingly act openly and honestly by the whole world, and yet fate has involved me in such a series of nets and toils and entanglements, that I dare hardly speak a word for fear of consequences, not to myself, but to others." "That is indeed a misfortune, Miss Vernon, which I do most sincerely compassionate, but which I should hardly have anticipated. Oh, Mr. Osbaldistone, if you but knew, if any one knew, what difficulty I sometimes find in hiding an aching heart with a smooth brow, you would indeed pity me. I do wrong perhaps in speaking to you even thus far on my own situation, but you are a young man of sense and penetration, you cannot but long to ask me 100 questions on the events of this day, on the share which Rashleigh has in your deliverance from this petty scrape, upon many other points which cannot but excite your attention, and I cannot bring myself to answer with the necessary falsehood and finesse. I should do it awkwardly, and lose your good opinion, if I have any share of it, as well as my own. It is best to say at once, ask me no questions. I have it not in my power to reply to them." Miss Vernon spoke these words with a tone of feeling which could not but make a corresponding impression upon me. I assured her she had neither to fear my urging her with impertinent questions, nor my misconstruing her declining to answer those which might in themselves be reasonable, or at least natural. I was too much obliged, I said, by the interest she had taken in my affairs, to misuse the opportunity her goodness had afforded me of prying into hers. I only trusted and entreated that if my services could at any time be useful, she would command them without doubt or hesitation. "Thank you, thank you," she replied. "Your voice does not ring the cuckoo chime of compliment, but speaks like that of one who knows to what he pledges himself. If, but it is impossible, but yet, if an opportunity should occur, I will ask you if you remember this promise, and I assure you I shall not be angry if I find you have forgotten it, for it is enough that you are sincere in your intentions just now. Much may occur to alter them ere I call upon you, should that moment ever come, to assist Die Vernon, as if you were Die Vernon's brother." "And if I were Die Vernon's brother," said I, "there could not be less chance that I should refuse my assistance. And now I am afraid I must not ask whether Rashleigh was willingly accessory to my deliverance." "Not of me, but you may ask it of himself, and depend upon it he will say yes; for rather than any good action should walk through the world like an unappropriated adjective in an ill-arranged sentence, he is always willing to stand noun substantive to it himself. And I must not ask whether this Campbell be himself the party who eased Mr. Morris of his portmanteau, or whether the letter which our friend the attorney received was not a finesse to withdraw him from the scene of action, lest he should have marred the happy event of my deliverance. And I must not ask, you must ask nothing of me," said Miss Vernon. "So it is quite in vain to go on putting cases. You are to think just as well of me as if I had answered all these queries, and 20 others besides, as glibly as Rashleigh could have done, and observe, whenever I touch my chin just so, it is a sign that I cannot speak upon the topic which happens to occupy your attention. I must settle signals of correspondence with you, because you are to be my confidant and my counsellor, only you are to know nothing whatever of my affairs." "Nothing can be more reasonable," I replied, laughing; "and the extent of your confidence will, you may rely upon it, only be equalled by the sagacity of my counsels."
This sort of conversation brought us, in the highest good humour with each other, to Osbaldistone Hall, where we found the family far advanced in the revels of the evening. "Get some dinner for Mr. Osbaldistone and me in the library," said Miss Vernon to a servant. "I must have some compassion upon you," she added, turning to me, "and provide against your starving in this mansion of brutal abundance. Otherwise I am not sure that I should show you my private haunts. This same library is my den, the only corner of the Hall house where I am safe from the orangutans, my cousins. They never venture there, I suppose, for fear the folios should fall down and crack their skulls, for they will never affect their heads in any other way. So follow me." And I followed through hall and bower, vaulted passage and winding stair, until we reached the room where she had ordered our refreshments. End of Volume 1, Chapter 9. Recording by Felicity Campbell, Whanganui, New Zealand.
Chapter 10 of Rob Roy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Catherine Lois. Rob Roy by Sir Walter Scott. Volume 1, Chapter 10. In the wide pile, by others needed not, hers was one sacred solitary spot, whose gloomy aisles and bending shelves contain for moral hunger food, and cures for moral pain. Anonymous. The library at Osbaldistone Hall was a gloomy room, whose antique oaken shelves bent beneath the weight of the ponderous folios so dear to the 17th century, from which, under favour be it spoken, we have distilled matter for our quartos and octavos, and which, once more subjected to the alembic, may, should our sons be yet more frivolous than ourselves, be still farther reduced into duodecimos and pamphlets. The collection was chiefly of the classics, as well foreign as ancient history, and above all divinity. It was in wretched order. The priests, who in succession had acted as chaplains at the hall, were for many years the only persons who entered its precincts, until Rashleigh's thirst for reading had led him to disturb the venerable spiders, who had muffled the fronts of the presses with their tapestry. His destination for the church rendered his conduct less absurd in his father's eyes than if any of his other descendants had betrayed so strange a propensity, and Sir Hildebrand acquiesced in the library receiving some repairs, so as to fit it for a sitting-room. Still, an air of dilapidation, as obvious as it was uncomfortable, pervaded the large apartment, and announced the neglect from which the knowledge which its walls contained had not been able to exempt it. The tattered tapestry, the worm-eaten shelves, the huge and clumsy, yet tottering, tables, desks, and chairs, the rusty grate, seldom gladdened by either sea-coal or fagots, intimated the contempt of the lords of Osbaldistone Hall for learning, and for the volumes which record its treasures. "You think this place somewhat disconsolate, I suppose?" said Diana, as I glanced my eye round the forlorn apartment. "But to me it seems like a little paradise, for I call it my own, and fear no intrusion. Rashleigh was joint proprietor with me, while we were friends." "And are you no longer so?" was my natural question. Her forefinger immediately touched her dimpled chin, with an arch look of prohibition. "We are still allies," she continued, "bound, like other confederate powers, by circumstances of mutual interest. But I am afraid, as will happen in other cases, the treaty of alliance has survived the amicable dispositions in which it had its origin. At any rate, we live less together. And when he comes through that door there, I vanish through this door here. And so, Having made the discovery that we two were one too many for this apartment, as large as it seems, Rashleigh, whose occasions frequently call him elsewhere, has generously made a cession of his rights in my favour, so that I now endeavour to prosecute alone the studies in which he used formerly to be my guide. And what are those studies, if I may presume to ask? Indeed you may, without the least fear of seeing my forefinger raised to my chin. Science and history are my principal favourites, but I also study poetry and the classics. And the classics? Do you read them in the original? Unquestionably. Rashleigh, who is no contemptible scholar, taught me Greek and Latin, as well as most of the languages of modern Europe. I assure you there has been some pains taken in my education, although I can neither sew a tucker nor work cross-stitch, nor make a pudding, nor, as the vicar's fat wife, with as much truth as elegance, goodwill, and politeness, was pleased to say in my behalf, do any other useful thing in the varsal world. And was this selection of studies Rashleigh's choice, or your own, Miss Vernon? I asked. Said she, as if hesitating to answer my question. It's not worth while lifting my finger about, after all. Why, partly his and partly mine. As I learned out of doors to ride a horse, and bridle and saddle him in cue of necessity, and to clear a 5-barred gate, and fire a gun without winking, and all other of those masculine accomplishments that my brute cousins run mad after, I wanted, like my rational cousin, to read Greek and Latin within doors, and make my complete approach to the tree of knowledge, which you men scholars would engross to yourselves, in revenge, I suppose, for our common mother's share in the great original transgression. And Rashleigh indulged your propensity to learning? Why, he wished to have me for his scholar, and he could but teach me that which he knew himself. He was not likely to instruct me in the mysteries of washing lace ruffles, or hemming cambric handkerchiefs, I suppose. I admit the temptation of getting such a scholar, and have no doubt that it made a weighty consideration on the tutor's part. Oh, if you begin to investigate Rashleigh's motives, my finger touches my chin once more. I can only be frank where my own are inquired into. But to resume, he has resigned the library in my favour, and never enters without leave had and obtained, and so I have taken the liberty to make it the place of deposit for some of my own goods and chattels, as you may see by looking round you. I beg pardon, Miss Vernon, but I really see nothing around these walls which I can distinguish as likely to claim you as mistress. That is, I suppose, because you neither see a shepherd or shepherdess wrought in worsted and handsomely framed in black ebony, or a stuffed parrot, or a breeding cage full of canary birds, or a housewife case broidered with tarnished silver, or a toilet table with a nest of japanned boxes with as many angles as Christmas minced pies, or a broken-backed spinet, or a lute with 3 strings, or rock-work, or shell-work, or needle-work, or work of any kind, or a lap-dog with a litter of blind puppies. None of these treasures do I possess, she continued, after a pause, in order to recover the breath she had lost in enumerating them. But there stands the sword of my ancestor, Sir Richard Vernon, slain at Shrewsbury, and sorely slandered by a sad fellow called Will Shakespeare, whose Lancastrian partialities, and a certain knack at embodying them, has turned history upside down, or rather inside out. And by that redoubted weapon hangs the mail of the still older Vernon, squire to the Black Prince, whose fate is the reverse of his descendants, since he is more indebted to the bard who took the trouble to celebrate him, for goodwill than for talents. Amidst the rout you may discern one brave knight with pipes on shield, yclept Vernon. Like a born fiend along the plain he thundered, pressed to be carving throatus while others plundered. Then there is a model of a new martingale, which I invented myself, a great improvement on the Duke of Newcastle's. And there are the hood and bells of my falcon Cheviot, who spitted himself on a heron's bill at Horsley Moss. Poor Cheviot, there is not a bird on the perches below but are kites and riflers compared to him. And there is my own light fowling piece with an improved firelock, with 20 other treasures, each more valuable than another. And there, that speaks for itself. She pointed to the carved oak frame of a full-length portrait by Van Dyck, on which were inscribed in Gothic letters the words Vernon semper viret. I looked at her for explanation. "Do you not know," said she, with some surprise, "our motto, the Vernon motto, where, like the solemn vice iniquity, we moralize two meanings in one word? And do you not know our cognizance, the pipes?" Pointing to the armorial bearings, sculpted on the oaken scutcheon, around which the legend was displayed. "Pipes? They look more like penny whistles. But pray do not be angry with my ignorance," I continued, observing the colour mount to her cheeks. "I can mean no affront to your armorial bearings, for I do not even know my own." "You an Osbaldistone, and confess so much!" she exclaimed. "Why, Percy, Thorny, John, Dickon, Wilfred himself might be your instructor. Even ignorance itself is a plummet over you." "With shame I confess it, my dear Miss Vernon. The mysteries couched under the grim hieroglyphics of heraldry are to me as unintelligible as those of the pyramids of Egypt." "What! Is it possible? Why, even my uncle reads Gwillym sometimes of a winter night. Not know the figures of heraldry! Of what could your father be thinking?" "Of the figures of arithmetic," I answered, "the most insignificant unit of which he holds more highly than all the blazonry of chivalry. But, though I am ignorant to this inexpressible degree, I have knowledge and taste enough to admire that splendid picture, in which I think I can discover a family likeness to you. What ease and dignity in the attitude! What richness of colouring! What breadth and depth of shade!" "Is it really a fine painting?" she asked. "I have seen many works of the renowned artist," I replied, "but never beheld one more to my liking." "Well, I know as little of pictures as you do of heraldry," replied Miss Vernon. "Yet I have the advantage of you, because I have always admired the painting without understanding its value. While I have neglected pipes and tabors, and all the whimsical combinations of chivalry, still I am informed that they floated in the fields of ancient fame. But you will allow their exterior appearance is not so peculiarly interesting as to the uninformed spectator as that of a fine painting. Who is the person here represented?" "My grandfather. He shared the misfortunes of Charles I, and, I am sorry to add, the excesses of his son. Our patrimonial estate was greatly impaired by his prodigality, and was altogether lost by his successor, my unfortunate father. But peace be with them who have got it. It was lost in the cause of loyalty." "Your father, I presume, suffered in the political dissensions of the period?" "He did indeed. He lost his all, and hence is his child a dependent orphan, eating the bread of others, subjected to their caprices, and compelled to study their inclinations. Yet prouder of having had such a father than if, playing a more prudent but less upright part, he had left me possessor of all the rich and fair baronies which his family once possessed." As she thus spoke, the entrance of the servants with dinner cut off all conversation but that of a general nature. When our hasty meal was concluded, and the wine placed on the table, the domestic informed us that Mr. Rashleigh had desired to be told when our dinner was removed. "Tell him," said Miss Vernon, "we shall be happy to see him if he will step this way. Place another wine-glass and chair, and leave the room. You must retire with him when he goes away," she continued, addressing herself to me. "Even my liberality cannot spare a gentleman above 8 hours of the 24, and I think we have been together for at least that length of time." "The old scythe-man has moved so rapidly," I answered, "that I could not count his strides." "Hush!" said Miss Vernon. "Here comes Rashleigh," and she drew off her chair, to which I had approached mine rather closely, so as to place a greater distance between us. A modest tap at the door, a gentle manner of opening when invited to enter, a studied softness and humility of step and deportment, announced that the education of Rashleigh Osbaldistone at the College of St. Omer's accorded well with the ideas I entertained of the manners of an accomplished Jesuit. I need not add that, as a sound Protestant, these ideas were not the most favourable. "Why should you use the ceremony of knocking," said Miss Vernon, "when you knew that I was not alone?" This was spoken with a burst of impatience, as if she had felt that Rashleigh's air of caution and reserve covered some insinuation of impertinent suspicion. "You have taught me the form of knocking at this door so perfectly, my fair cousin," answered Rashleigh, without change of voice or manner, "that habit has become a second nature." "I prize sincerity more than courtesy, sir, and you know I do," was Miss Vernon's reply. "Courtesy is a gallant gay, a courtier by name and by profession," replied Rashleigh, "and therefore most fit for a lady's bower." "But sincerity is the true knight," retorted Miss Vernon, "and therefore much more welcome, cousin. But to end a debate not over amusing to your stranger kinsman, sit down, Rashleigh, and give Mr. Francis Osbaldistone your countenance to his glass of wine. I have done the honours of the dinner, for the credit of Osbaldistone Hall." Rashleigh sat down and filled his glass, glancing his eye from Diana to me, with an embarrassment which his utmost efforts could not entirely disguise. I thought he appeared to be uncertain concerning the extent of confidence she might have reposed in me, and hastened to lead the conversation into a channel which should sweep away his suspicion that Diana might have betrayed any secrets which rested between them. "Miss Vernon," I said, "Mr. Rashleigh has recommended me to return my thanks to you for my speedy disengagement from the ridiculous accusation of Morris, and, unjustly fearing my gratitude might not be warm enough to remind me of this duty, she has put my curiosity on its side, by referring me to you for an account, or rather explanation, of the events of the day." "Indeed," answered Rashleigh, "I should have thought," looking keenly at Miss Vernon, "that the lady herself might have stood interpreter." And his eye, reverting from her face, sought mine, as if to search from the expression of my features whether Diana's communication had been as narrowly limited as my words had intimated. Miss Vernon retorted his inquisitorial glance with one of decided scorn, while I, uncertain whether to deprecate or resent his obvious suspicion, replied, "If it is your pleasure, Mr. Rashleigh, as it has been Miss Vernon's, to leave me in ignorance, I must necessarily submit. But pray do not withhold your information from me on the ground of imagining that I have already obtained any on the subject, for I tell you, as a man of honour, I am as ignorant as that picture of anything relating to the events I have witnessed to-day, excepting that I understand from Miss Vernon that you have been kindly active in my favour." "Miss Vernon has overrated my humble efforts," said Rashleigh, "though I claim full credit for my zeal. The truth is, that as I galloped back to get some one of our family to join me in becoming your bail, which was the most obvious, or indeed I may say the only way of serving you which occurred to my stupidity, I met the man Colville, Campbell, or whatsoever they call him. I had understood from Morris that he was present when the robbery took place, and had the good fortune to prevail on him, with some difficulty, I confess, to tender his evidence in your exculpation, which I presume was the means of your being released from an unpleasant situation. Indeed, I am much your debtor for procuring such a seasonable evidence in my behalf, but I cannot see why, having been, as he said, a fellow sufferer with Morris, it should have required much trouble to persuade him to step forth and bear evidence, whether to convict the actual robber or free an innocent person. "You do not know the genius of that man's country, sir," answered Rashleigh. "Discretion, prudence, and foresight are their leading qualities. These are only modified by a narrow-spirited but yet ardent patriotism, which forms as it were the outmost of the concentric bulwarks with which a Scotchman fortifies himself against all the attacks of a generous philanthropical principle. Surmount this mound, you find an inner and still dearer barrier, the love of his province, his village, or most probably his clan. Storm this second obstacle, you have a third, his attachment to his own family, his father, mother, sons, daughters, uncles, aunts, and cousins, to the 9th generation. It is within these limits that a Scotchman's social affection expands itself, never reaching those which are outermost, till all means of discharging itself in the interior circles have been exhausted. It is within these circles that his heart throbs, each pulsation being fainter and fainter, till, beyond the widest boundary, it is almost unfelt. And what is worst of all, could you surmount all these concentric outworks, you have an inner citadel, deeper, higher, and more efficient than them all, a Scotchman's love for himself. "All this is extremely eloquent and metaphorical, Rashleigh," said Miss Vernon, who listened with unrepressed impatience. "There are only two objections to it. First, it is not true. Secondly, if true, it is nothing to the purpose." "It is true, my fairest Diana," returned Rashleigh, "and moreover it is most instantly to the purpose. It is true, because you cannot deny that I know the country and people intimately, and the character is drawn from deep and accurate consideration. And it is to the purpose, because it answers Mr. Francis Osbaldistone's question, and shows why this same wary Scotchman, considering our kinsman to be neither his countryman, nor a Campbell, nor his cousin in any of the inextricable combinations by which they extend their pedigree, and above all, seeing no prospect of personal advantage, but on the contrary, much hazard of loss of time and delay of business, with other inconveniences, perhaps, of a nature yet more formidable," interrupted Miss Vernon. "Of which doubtless there might be many," said Rashleigh, continuing in the same tone. "In short, my theory shows why this man, hoping for no advantage, and afraid of some inconvenience, might require a degree of persuasion ere he could be prevailed on to give his testimony in favour of Mr. Osbaldistone." "It seems surprising to me," I observed, "that during the glance I cast over the declaration, or whatever it is termed, of Mr. Morris, he should never have mentioned that Campbell was in his company when he met the marauders." "I understood from Campbell that he had taken his solemn promise not to mention that circumstance," replied Rashleigh. "His reason for exacting such an engagement you may guess from what I have hinted. He wished to get back to his own country, undelayed and unembarrassed by any of the judicial inquiries which he would have been under the necessity of attending, had the fact of his being present at the robbery taken air while he was on this side of the border. But let him once be as distant as the Forth, Morris will, I warrant you, come forth with all he knows about him, and, it may be, a good deal more. Besides, Campbell is a very extensive dealer in cattle, and has often occasion to send great droves into Northumberland, and, when driving such a trade, he would be a great fool to embroil himself with our Northumbrian thieves, than whom no men who live are more vindictive." "I dare be sworn of that," said Miss Vernon, with a tone which implied something more than a simple acquiescence in the proposition. "Still," I said, resuming the subject, "allowing the force of the reasons which Campbell might have for desiring that Morris should be silent with regard to his promise when the robbery was committed, I cannot yet see how he could attain such an influence over the man as to make him suppress his evidence in that particular, at the manifest risk of subjecting his story to discredit." Rashleigh agreed with me that it was very extraordinary, and seemed to regret that he had not questioned the Scotchman more closely on that subject, which he allowed looked extremely mysterious. "But," he asked, immediately after this acquiescence, "are you very sure the circumstance of Morris's being accompanied by Campbell is really not alluded to in his examination?" "I read the paper over hastily," said I, "but it is my strong impression that no such circumstance is mentioned. At least, it must have been touched on very slightly, since it failed to catch my attention." "True, true," answered Rashleigh, forming his own inference while he adopted my words. "I incline to think with you, that the circumstance must in reality have been mentioned, but so slightly that it failed to attract your attention. And then, as to Campbell's interest with Morris, I incline to suppose that it must have been gained by playing upon his fears. This chicken-hearted fellow Morris is bound, I understand, for Scotland, destined for some little employment under government, and, possessing the courage of the wrathful dove, or most magnanimous mouse, he may have been afraid to encounter the ill will of such a kill-cow as Campbell, whose very appearance would be enough to fright him out of his little wits. You observed that Mr. Campbell has at times a keen and animated manner, something of a martial cast in his tone and bearing. I own, I replied, that his expression struck me as being occasionally fierce and sinister, and little adapted to his peaceable professions. Has he served in the army? Yes, no, not strictly speaking served, but he has been, I believe, like most of his countrymen, trained to arms. Indeed, among the hills, they carry them from boyhood to the grave. So, if you know anything of your fellow traveller, you will easily judge that, going to such a country, he will take cue to avoid a quarrel, if he can help it, with any of the natives. But come, I see you decline your wine, and I too am a degenerate Osbaldistone, so far as respects the circulation of the bottle. If you will go to my room, I will hold you a hand at piquet. We rose to take leave of Miss Vernon, who had from time to time suppressed, apparently with difficulty, a strong temptation to break in upon Rashleigh's details. As we were about to leave the room, the smothered fire broke forth. "Mr. Osbaldistone," she said, "your own observation will enable you to verify the justice or injustice of Rashleigh's suggestions concerning such individuals as Mr. Campbell and Mr. Morris. But, in slandering Scotland, he has borne false witness against a whole country, and I request you will allow no weight to his evidence." "Perhaps," I answered, "I may find it somewhat difficult to obey your injunction, Miss Vernon, for I must own I was bred up with no very favourable idea of our northern neighbours." "Distrust that part of your education, sir," she replied, "and let the daughter of a Scotchwoman pray you to respect the land which gave her parent birth, until your own observation has proved them to be unworthy of your good opinion. Preserve your hatred and contempt for dissimulation, baseness, and falsehood, wheresoever they are to be met with. You will find enough of all without leaving England. Adieu, gentlemen. I wish you good evening." And she signed to the door with the manner of a princess dismissing her train. We retired to Rashleigh's apartment, where a servant brought us coffee and cards. I had formed my resolution to press Rashleigh no farther on the events of the day. A mystery, and, as I thought, not of a favourable complexion, appeared to hang over his conduct, but to ascertain if my suspicions were just, it was necessary to throw him off his guard. We cut for the deal, and were soon earnestly engaged in our play. I thought I perceived in this trifling for amusement, for the stake which Rashleigh proposed was a mere trifle, something of a fierce and ambitious temper. He seemed perfectly to understand the beautiful game at which he played, but preferred, as it were on principle, the risking bold and precarious strokes to the ordinary rules of play. And, neglecting the minor and better balanced chances of the game, he hazarded everything for the chance of piquing, repiquing, or capoting his adversary. So soon as the intervention of a game or two at piquet, like the music between the acts of a drama, had completely interrupted our previous course of conversation, Rashleigh appeared to tire of the game, and the cards were superseded by discourse, in which he assumed the lead. More learned than soundly wise, better acquainted with men's minds than with the moral principles that ought to regulate them, he had still powers of conversation which I have rarely seen equalled, never excelled. Of this his manner implied some consciousness. At least it appeared to me that he had studied hard to improve his natural advantages of a melodious voice, fluent and happy expression, apt language, and fervid imagination. He was never loud, never overbearing, never so much occupied with his own thoughts as to outrun either the patience or the comprehension of those he conversed with. His ideas succeeded each other with the gentle but unintermitting flow of a plentiful and bounteous spring. While I have heard those of others, who aimed at distinction in conversation rush along like the turbid gush from the sluice of a mill-pond, as hurried and as easily exhausted. It was late at night ere I could part from a companion so fascinating, and, when I gained my own apartment, it cost me no small effort to recall to my mind the character of Rashleigh, such as I had pictured him previous to this tete-a-tete. So effectual, my dear Tresham, does the sense of being pleased and amused blunt our facilities of perception and discrimination of character, that I can only compare it to the taste of certain fruits, at once luscious and poignant, which renders our palate totally unfit for relishing or distinguishing the viands which are subsequently subjected to its criticism. End of Volume 1, Chapter 10. Recording by Catherine, Hong Kong.
Rob Roy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Rob Roy by Sir Walter Scott. Chapter 11th. What gars ye gaunt, my merry men a'? What gars ye look so dreary? What gars ye hing your head sae sere in the castle of Balwearie? Old Scotch Ballad. The next morning chanced to be Sunday, a day peculiarly hard to be got rid of at Osbaldistone Hall, for after the formal religious service of the morning had been performed, at which all the family regularly attended, it was hard to say upon which individual, Rashleigh and Miss Vernon excepted, the fiend of ennui descended with the most abundant outpouring of his spirit. To speak of my yesterday's embarrassment amused Sir Hildebrand for several minutes, and he congratulated me on my deliverance from Morpeth or Hexham jail, as he would have done if I had fallen in attempting to clear a 5-barred gate, and got up without hurting myself. "Hast had a lucky turn, lad, but do not be over-venturous again. What, man, the King's road is free to all men, be they Whigs, be they Tories." "On my word, sir, I am innocent of interrupting it. And it is the most provoking thing on earth that every person will take it for granted that I am an accessory to a crime which I despise and detest, and which would, moreover, deservedly forfeit my life to the laws of my country." "Well, well, lad, even so be it. I ask no questions. No man bound to tell on himsell, that's fair play, or the devil's in it." Rashleigh here came to my assistance, but I could not help thinking that his arguments were calculated rather as hints to his father to put on a show of acquiescence in my declaration of innocence, than fully to establish it. "In your own house, my dear sir, and your own nephew, you will not surely persist in hurting his feelings by seeming to discredit what he is so strongly interested in affirming. No doubt you are fully deserving of all his confidence, and I am sure, were there anything you could do to assist him in this strange affair, he would have had recourse to your goodness. But my cousin Frank has been dismissed as an innocent man, and no one is entitled to suppose him otherwise. For my part, I have not the least doubt of his innocence, and our family honour, I conceive, requires that we should maintain it with tongue and sword against the whole country." "Rashleigh," said his father, looking fixedly at him, "thou art a sly loon. Thou hast ever been too cunning for me, and too cunning for most folks. Have a care thou prove not too cunning for thyself. Two faces under one hood is no true heraldry. And since we talk of heraldry, I'll go and read Gwillym." This resolution he intimated with a yawn, resistless as that of the goddess in the Dunciad, which was responsively echoed by his giant sons, as they dispersed in quest of the pastimes to which their minds severally inclined them. Percy to discuss a pot of March beer with the steward in the buttery, Thorncliff to cut a pair of cudgels and fix them in their wicker hilts, John to dress mayflies, Dickon to play at pitch and toss by himself, his right hand against his left, and Wilfred to bite his thumbs and hum himself into a slumber, which should last until dinner time, if possible. Miss Vernon had retired to the library. Rashleigh and I were left alone in the old hall, from which the servants, with their usual bustle and awkwardness, had at length contrived to hurry the remains of our substantial breakfast. I took the opportunity to upbraid him with the manner in which he had spoken of my affair to his father, which I frankly stated was highly offensive to me, as it seemed rather to exhort Sir Hildebrand to conceal his suspicions than to root them out. "Why, what can I do, my dear friend?" replied Rashleigh. "My father's disposition is so tenacious of suspicions of all kinds, when once they take root, which, to do him justice, does not easily happen, that I have always found it the best way to silence him upon such subjects, instead of arguing with him. Thus I get the better of the weeds which I cannot eradicate, by cutting them over as often as they appear, until at length they die away of themselves. There is neither wisdom nor profit in disputing with such a mind as Sir Hildebrand's, which hardens itself against conviction, and believes in its own inspirations as firmly as we good Catholics do in those of the Holy Father of Rome. It is very hard, though, that I should live in the house of a man, and he a near relation too, who will persist in believing me guilty of highway robbery. My father's foolish opinion, if one may give that epithet to any opinion of a father's, does not affect your real innocence, and as to the disgrace of the fact, depend on it, that, considered in all its bearings, political as well as moral, Sir Hildebrand regards it as a meritorious action, a weakening of the enemy, a spoiling of the Amalekites, and you will stand the higher in his regard for your supposed accession to it." "I desire no man's regard, Mr. Rashleigh, on such terms as must sink me in my own, and I think these injurious suspicions will afford a very good reason for quitting Osbaldistone Hall, which I shall do whenever I can communicate on the subject with my father." The dark countenance of Rashleigh, though little accustomed to betray its master's feelings, exhibited a suppressed smile, which he instantly chastened by a sigh. "You are a happy man, Frank. You go and come as the wind bloweth where it listeth. With your address, tastes, and talents, you will soon find circles where they will be more valued than amid the dull inmates of this mansion, while he paused. "And what is there in your lot that can make you or any one envy mine, an outcast, as I may almost term myself, from my father's house and favour?" "Ay, but," answered Rashleigh, "consider the gratified sense of independence which you must have attained by a very temporary sacrifice, for such I am sure yours will prove to be. Consider the power of acting as a free agent, of cultivating your own talents in the way to which your taste determines you, and in which you are well qualified to distinguish yourself. Fame and freedom are cheaply purchased by a few weeks' residence in the north, even though your place of exile be Osbaldistone Hall. A second Ovid in Thrace. You have not his reasons for writing Tristia." "I do not know," said I, blushing, as became a young scribbler, "how you should be so well acquainted with my truant studies." "There was an emissary of your father's here some time since, a young coxcomb, one Twynall, who informed me concerning your secret sacrifices to the Muses, and added, that some of your verses had been greatly admired by the best judges." "Tresham, I believe you are guiltless of having ever essayed to build the lofty rhyme. But you must have known in your day many an apprentice and fellow craft, if not some of the master masons, in the temple of Apollo. Vanity is their universal foible, from him who decorated the shades of Twickenham to the veriest scribbler whom he has lashed in his Dunciad. I had my own share of this common failing, and without considering how little likely this young fellow Twynall was, by taste and habits, either to be acquainted with one or two little pieces of poetry which I had at times insinuated into Button's coffee house, or to report the opinion of the critics who frequented that resort of wit and literature, I almost instantly gorged the bait, which Rashleigh perceiving, improved his opportunity by a diffident, yet apparently very anxious request to be permitted to see some of my manuscript productions. "You shall give me an evening in my own apartment," he continued, "for I must soon lose the charms of literary society for the drudgery of commerce, and the coarse everyday avocations of the world. I repeat it, that my compliance with my father's wishes for the advantage of my family is indeed a sacrifice, especially considering the calm and peaceful profession to which my education destined me." I was vain, but not a fool, and this hypocrisy was too strong for me to swallow. "You would not persuade me," I replied, "that you really regret to exchange the situation of an obscure Catholic priest, with all its privations, for wealth and society, and the pleasures of the world?" Rashleigh saw that he had coloured his affectation of moderation too highly, and after a second's pause, during which I suppose he calculated the degree of candour which it was necessary to use with me, that being a quality of which he was never needlessly profuse, he answered with a smile, "At my age, to be condemned, as you say, to wealth and the world does not indeed sound so alarming as perhaps it ought to do. But, with pardon be it spoken, you have mistaken my destination. A Catholic priest, if you will, but not an obscure one. No, sir, Rashleigh Osbaldistone will be more obscure, should he rise to be the richest citizen in London, than he might have been as a member of a church whose ministers, as some one says, set their sandalled feet on princes. My family interest at a certain exiled court is high, and the weight which that court ought to possess, and does possess at Rome, is yet higher. My talents not altogether inferior to the education I have received. In sober judgment, I might have looked forward to a high eminence in the church, in the dream of fancy to the very highest. Why might not?" he added, laughing, for it was part of his manner to keep much of his discourse apparently betwixt jest and earnest. "Why might not Cardinal Osbaldistone have swayed the fortunes of empires, well born and well connected, as well as the low born Mazarin, or Alberoni, the son of an Italian gardener? Nay, I can give you no reason to the contrary, but in your place I should not much regret losing the chance of such precarious and invidious elevation." "Neither would I," he replied, "were I sure that my present establishment was more certain; but that must depend upon circumstances which I can only learn by experience. The disposition of your father, for example." "Confess the truth without finesse, Rashleigh. You would willingly know something of him from me." "Since, like Die Vernon, you make a point of following the banner of the good knight Sincerity, I reply, certainly." "Well, then, you will find in my father a man who has followed the paths of thriving more for the exercise they afforded to his talents than for the love of the gold with which they are strewed. His active mind would have been happy in any situation which gave it scope for exertion, though that exertion had been its sole reward. But his wealth has accumulated because, moderate and frugal in his habits, no new sources of expense have occurred to dispose of his increasing income. He is a man who hates dissimulation in others, never practises it himself, and is peculiarly alert in discovering motives through the colouring of language. Himself silent by habit, he is readily disgusted by great talkers, the rather that the circumstances by which he is most interested afford no great scope for conversation. He is severely strict in the duties of religion, but you have no reason to fear his interference with yours, for he regards toleration as a sacred principle of political economy. But if you have any Jacobitical partialities, as is naturally to be supposed, you will do well to suppress them in his presence, as well as the least tendency to the high-flying or Tory principles, for he holds both in utter detestation. For the rest, his word is his own bond, and must be the law of all who act under him. He will fail in his duty to no one, and will permit no one to fail towards him. To cultivate his favour, you must execute his commands, instead of echoing his sentiments. His greatest failings arise out of prejudices connected with his own profession, or rather his exclusive devotion to it, which makes him see little worthy of praise or attention, unless it be in some measure connected with commerce." "Oh, rare painted portrait!" exclaimed Rashleigh when I was silent. "Van Dyck was a dauber to you, Frank. I see thy sire before me in all his strength and weakness, loving and honouring the king as a sort of Lord Mayor of the Empire, or Chief of the Board of Trade, venerating the Commons for the acts regulating the export trade, and respecting the peers because the Lord Chancellor sits on a woolsack. Mine was a likeness, Rashleigh, yours is a caricature. But in return for the carte du pays, which I have unfolded to you, give me some lights on the geography of the unknown lands." "On which you are wrecked," said Rashleigh. "It is not worth while. It is no isle of Calypso, umbrageous with shade and intricate with sylvan labyrinth, but a bare, ragged Northumbrian moor, with as little to interest curiosity as to delight the eye. You may descry it in all its nakedness in half an hour's survey, as well as if I were to lay it down before you by line and compass." "Oh, but something there is worthy a more attentive survey. What say you to Miss Vernon? Does she not form an interesting object in the landscape, where all round is rude as Iceland's coast?" I could plainly perceive that Rashleigh disliked the topic now presented to him, but my frank communication had given me the advantageous title to make inquiries in my turn. Rashleigh felt this, and found himself obliged to follow my lead, however difficult he might find it to play his cards successfully. "I have known less of Miss Vernon," he said, "for some time than I was wont to do formerly. In early age I was her tutor, but as she advanced towards womanhood, My various avocations, the gravity of the profession to which I was destined, the peculiar nature of her engagements, our mutual situation, in short, rendered a close and constant intimacy dangerous and improper. I believe Miss Vernon might consider my reserve as unkindness, but it was my duty. I felt as much as she seemed to do, when compelled to give way to prudence. But where was the safety in cultivating an intimacy with a beautiful and susceptible girl whose heart, you are aware, must be given either to the cloister or to a betrothed husband? The cloister or a betrothed husband? I echoed. Is that the alternative destined for Miss Vernon? It is indeed, said Rashleigh with a sigh. I need not, I suppose, caution you against the danger of cultivating too closely the friendship of Miss Vernon. You are a man of the world, and know how far you can indulge yourself in her society with safety to yourself and justice to her. But I warn you that, considering her ardent temper, you must let your experience keep guard over her as well as yourself, for the specimen of yesterday may serve to show her extreme thoughtlessness and neglect of decorum. There was something, I was sensible, of truth as well as good sense in all this. It seemed to be given as a friendly warning, and I had no right to take it amiss. Yet I felt I could with pleasure have run Rashleigh Osbaldistone through the body all the time he was speaking. The deuce take his insolence, was my internal meditation. Would he wish me to infer that Miss Vernon had fallen in love with that hatchet face of his, and had become degraded so low as to require his shyness to cure her of an imprudent passion? I will have his meaning from him, was my resolution, if I should drag it out with cart ropes. For this purpose I placed my temper under as accurate a guard as I could, and observed that for a lady of her good sense and acquired accomplishments it was to be regretted that Miss Vernon's manners were rather blunt and rustic. "Frank and unreserved, at least, to the extreme," replied Rashleigh. "Yet, trust me, she has an excellent heart. To tell you the truth, should she continue her extreme aversion to the cloister and to her destined husband, and should my own labours in the mine of Plutus promise to secure me a decent independence, I shall think of reviewing our acquaintance, and sharing it with Miss Vernon." With all his fine voice and well-turned periods, thought I, this same Rashleigh Osbaldistone is the ugliest and most conceited coxcomb I ever met with. "But," continued Rashleigh, as if thinking aloud, "I should not like to supplant Thorncliff." "Supplant Thorncliff? Is your brother Thorncliff," I inquired with great surprise, "the destined husband of Diana Vernon?" "Why, ay. Her father's commands, and a certain family contract, destined her to marry one of Sir Hildebrand's sons. A dispensation has been obtained from Rome to Diana Vernon to marry Osbaldistone, Esquire, son of Sir Hildebrand Osbaldistone, of Osbaldistone Hall, Bart, and so forth, and it only remains to pitch upon the happy man whose name shall fill the gap in the manuscript. Now, as Percy is seldom sober, my father pitched on Thorncliff, as the second prop of the family, and therefore most proper to carry on the line of the Osbaldistones." "The young lady," said I, forcing myself to assume an air of pleasantry which, I believe, became me extremely ill, "would perhaps have been inclined to look a little lower on the family tree for the branch to which she was desirous of clinging." "I cannot say," he replied. "There is room for little choice in our family. Dick is a gambler, John a boor, and Wilfred an ass. I believe my father really made the best selection for poor Di after all." "The present company," said I, "being always excepted." "Oh, my destination to the church placed me out of the question. Otherwise, I will not affect to say, that, qualified by my education both to instruct and guide Miss Vernon, I might not have been a more creditable choice than any of my elders." "And so thought the young lady, doubtless." "You are not to suppose so," answered Rashleigh, with an affectation of denial, which was contrived to convey the strongest affirmation the case admitted of. "Friendship, only friendship, formed the tie betwixt us, and the tender affection of an opening mind to its only instructor. Love came not near us. I told you I was wise in time." I felt little inclination to pursue this conversation any farther, and shaking myself clear of Rashleigh, withdrew to my own apartment, which I recollect I traversed with much vehemence of agitation, repeating aloud the expressions which had most offended me. Susceptible, ardent, tender affection, love, Diana Vernon, the most beautiful creature I ever beheld, in love with him, the bandy-legged, bull-necked, limping scoundrel, Richard the Third in all but his hump back. and yet the opportunities he must have had during his cursed course of lectures, and the fellow's flowing and easy strain of sentiment, and her extreme seclusion from every one who spoke and acted with common sense, ay, and her obvious pique at him, mixed with admiration of his talents, which looked as like the result of neglected attachment as anything else. Well, and what is it to me that I should storm and rage at it? Is Diana Vernon the first pretty girl that has loved and married an ugly fellow? And if she were free of every Osbaldistone of them, what concern is it of mine? A Catholic, a Jacobite, a termagant into the boot. For me to look that way were utter madness. By throwing such reflections on the flame of my displeasure, I subdued it into a sort of smouldering heart-burning, and appeared at the dinner-table in as sulky a humour as could well be imagined. End of chapter 11.